of our students this year. Thank you.
The scripture reading this morning is from the Gospel of John, 9th chapter, first 11 verses. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. He replied, "The man they call Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." May God add his blessing to the reading of his word.
This week we continue in this short 3-week series on the words in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 to 16. And we're looking at this whole idea of being a light to the world. And as we think about light, we sometimes think about the view that you can see out the window when the light is shining brightly. And sometimes we know that that view is blocked by a curtain or someone or something standing in the way. And so I kind of have titled this message, "Are you a curtain or a window?" What are you when it comes to sharing the glory of God? Are you getting in the way? Or are you hiding what your testimony could be? Or are you sharing it brightly so that people can see through you to the God that we worship above? We're talking about Sunday school and the kids and growing up and all of that, and what song comes to mind when I think about the light of the world is the old children's Sunday school song, "This little light of mine, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine." We all know that children's hymn. Many of us can sing it by heart. It's so simple to sing, but it's so hard to embody, to let that light shine. What does it mean to let that light shine? We're looking again, as I said, at Matthew 5. And last week we talked about what it meant to be salt. How we have that opportunity to flavor the world, to make a difference, to be transformative in our relationships with others. Well, today we're looking at the second part of this passage. And Jesus said to let our light shine. How do we do it? You know, last week Lori and I were gifted an overnight stay at the Watch Hill Motor Court. Now, the chief said when he said that he had arranged for some of the members to have this opportunity, he said, "Now I got to tell you, it is not the Ocean House." But it's nice, and you're down in Watch Hill, and there's quite a view, and it's probably one of the oldest buildings down there. But when we got there, you know, the motel isn't much to look at, especially in comparison to the other houses. But the view from the window was spectacular. When you open those curtains, you can see God's creativity and the beauty, and the sunset in the evening was breathtaking. When we got there, the caretaker said, "I put the air conditioner on because it was rather warm, and I opened the curtains so you could enjoy the view." And I can tell you that I would have been extremely disappointed if the curtains were closed and we missed the amazing sunset down there. Well, our story today is about catching a glimpse of the glory of God. And in this story in John chapter 9, if you pay attention, you really get to see God's handiwork in action. You get to see the light of the world spreading out and changing one life of many. In Matthew chapter 11, John the Baptist was facing death. He was beginning to have doubts about his ministry, so he sends his friends to ask Jesus for proof that he really is the Messiah. Jesus sends back this message. He says, "Go and tell John what you hear and what you see, that the blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. Lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them." Now, why was this important? Because hundreds of years earlier, Isaiah the prophet said the very same thing would happen upon the arrival of the Messiah. The blind would see, the deaf would hear, the good news would be proclaimed. And this is what Jesus was doing. This is what was happening as his light came upon the seas of Galilee and all across Israel. So I want to talk about this story in John 9 this morning and suggest maybe a couple of ways that we can reflect the glory of God and be a light to the world. Here's what Jesus says in John chapter 5, verse 14. "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others." You know, Jesus was encouraging us to let our testimonies out, to let what we know about Jesus be a part of our lives so that others will see it and know and then lean into him. You know, and it's interesting, and maybe it's appropriate that we talk about this today because more and more people who go to express their faith are pushed back upon. And so some of us have had this tendency over the years not to mention the fact that we belong to Christ or we go to church or whatnot. Someone once said that some of us as Christians are the best secret agents God ever sent out there because no one knows that we believe in him. But Jesus tells us we need to tell the world. We need to let his love, his grace, his story, his gospel shine through. And that brings us to this story in John chapter 9. You see, this man that they encountered along the road had a problem. He was blind, and he'd been that way since birth. He'd learned to get along okay. Not perfectly, not well, but he learned to survive. And the truth is, many of us can understand that because we've dealt with chronic illness or chronic problems, or we've been dealing with something in our life that is just there and it's stopping us from living life more fully. But we learn to deal with it. And this man did. And the interesting thing in this story is that the man, as he sees Jesus and his disciples coming, doesn't ask him to be healed. Very, very often in other places we see men and women, lepers and the blind and the lame. They're looking to Jesus and they see him coming and they call out to him. But this man is just there silent, resigned to the fact that this is his life and nothing will ever change. And that prompts his disciples to ask Jesus a question. They see the man standing there in his infirmity, and one of the disciples, we don't know which one, says, Master, you see that man over there? What caused him to be blind? Was it something that he did or something his parents did? And you see, that was the understanding, that if you had some kind of an infirmity, some kind of an illness, that you did something or your parents did something, there was a reason for it, and you deserved what you had. You know, the truth is, some people still believe that when they see someone who's suffering. Well, Jesus doesn't stop there. He uses this moment as a teachable moment. And so he says, neither. And then he reaches down, he spits in the mud, and he makes a little bit of a mud compact, and he puts it on the man's eyes. And then he says, go and wash in the pool of Siloam, and you'll be healed. So it's interesting there. It's the only time that Jesus does that. Jesus heals in many ways. Sometimes he just touches a man. Sometimes they just touch him. Sometimes he just speaks a word. Sometimes he gives them something to do. Pick up your mat and walk. But this time he actually made this concoction out of mud and spit, put it on his eyes, and tells him to go and wash. gives him something to do. And so the man goes and he's healed. And all of a sudden he can see for the first time in his life. Can you imagine that? Most of us can't imagine what it's like to be able to see the first time. And to see all the magnificent colors, to see the world in full blossom and bloom. We take it for granted because we can see. This man suddenly saw everything, and he was exuberant. And when he came back to his home and his village, people looked at him, and they couldn't believe it was the same man. And they would say, it's got to be somebody else. It's a look-alike. It's a double. That's not the man we know, that we've seen all our lives. And he said, no, it's me, and I can see. I can see. There was a man I met on the road, and he came and he healed me. And they kept questioning him. Well, you got to still be blind. You can't see. That just doesn't happen. And he says, hey, I don't know how it happened, but I know that man came to me, and I was blind, but now I see. That man did it. The story continues, of course, and the Pharisees get involved. They're the religious leaders, and they question the man, and they try to dig up dirt on Jesus. It's kind of like, what happens today in political circles, what's been happening for years. They see something good, and they figure there's got to be some ulterior motive. There's got to be something behind it. So instead of seeing the miracle for what it was, a gracious act of God, they keep looking for ways to bury Jesus. And the miracle didn't really matter. They ignored the reality of that situation and the testimony of that man. You see, these men, these leaders hated Jesus so much that they'd do anything to discredit him. They called in the blind man 2 or 3 times when they didn't get the right answer. When he said, hey, I don't know. He must be a man of God. He's got to be a prophet because look what he did to me. All of a sudden, I was blind, but now I see. He said that several times. He kept telling them, I was blind, but now I see. This man changed my life. And now I have a whole new world in front of me that I can enjoy. And when that didn't work, they couldn't get the answer, they called in his parents. It's kind of like being called to the principal's office, Okay, come on down here, we want to talk to you. In the end, there was undeniable proof that this was a legitimate miracle. But the Pharisees were blind to see it. And Jesus said, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. And so the Pharisees, with all of their special privileges, with all of their position and place in life, were blind to what God was doing right there in their midst. They would not see. Now, being physically blind is hard. But being blind to God is far worse. We all know people who just don't see God, like the Pharisees. He's right there in front of them. He's working miracles. He's doing great things, but they don't want to see Him. I talked to one family that was connected to the church years ago, and I said to them, hey, I'd love to come out and visit, and we can talk more. And the woman said, well, let me go talk to my boyfriend, and we'll set up a time. Well, she didn't come back. And it became apparent that they really didn't want to talk about faith and God. Why? I don't know. We don't know. So how do you get to people like that? How do you break through the barriers so that you can share the good news with them? Well, let me say first off that we can't do it, but God does. That's why prayer is so important. So if you've been talking with someone and they seem to be lost and they're struggling and they're sinking below the water and they just can't seem to find their way up, begin with prayer. Just pray for them. You may not have to say a word, but maybe God will then nudge you to do that. But pray, because God is the one who changes life. Just like God is the one who gave this man his sight, God is the one who can give the spiritually blind their sight as well. You may try to argue with them and convince them, and you'll just bang your head against the wall. But pray for them. That's the point of this passage in Matthew 5. We've got to let our light shine. We've got to pray for people. We've got to share our stories. We've got to do the same thing that blind man did. All we have to do is tell people what Jesus did for us, how our lives have been changed, how we were stumbling and He lifted us up. Talk about Jesus the same way you talk about anything that you love. I said this in the earlier service. I said, if when I die, everyone who says something says, boy, he loved the Detroit Tigers. He was always talking about the Detroit Tigers. Then my life would have been a failure. Because that's not what I'm about. I love the Tigers and they're fun and whatnot like that, but my life is about Jesus Christ. And if that's not shining through, then I'm doing something wrong and I need to work harder. And maybe I need to work harder. But that's what we're called to do, is to share our faith in the same way we share the most important things in our life. John Newton told his story, in the lyrics of that famous Christian hymn, Amazing Grace. He echoed the words of the blind man in the story. But Newton wasn't talking about physical blindness. He was talking about a spiritual blindness, the way he had walked and lived through life, the way that he had abandoned God and disregarded God, and then all of a sudden, one day, his eyes were opened. He'd refused to see God until that one day when it all came crashing down on him. Then his life changed forever. That's when he declared that he was blind, but now he could see. You know, there's a wonderful story about Helen Keller, who was both blind and deaf, but because of her courage and determination. You talk about overcoming the circumstances of her life. She became very well known. And her story got out there, and people took note of it. And on one occasion, she had the opportunity to meet Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. And she was just overjoyed at the opportunity. And so she got there and she shook his hand. And when she would comment on that day, meeting the famous Mark Twain, she would say, "I could feel the twinkle of his eye in his handshake." I could feel the twinkle of his eye in his handshake. There was something within him that just radiated that wit and humor, and you didn't even need to see it. That's letting your light shine. That the Spirit of Jesus Christ should be in us in such a way that when people encounter us, that they feel like they have met Jesus. That's letting His light shine through us, so that they may not even know that we're a Christian, but they know that there's something different about us. And I'll tell you, it's hard to do, because in this world we live in, there are a lot of critics. There are a lot of cranks. There are a lot of people who the first word out of their mouth is to put you down. Just like the Pharisees. But nothing could stop that man, and I pray nothing stops you. You know, there were a couple of people in my life, we were recognizing the teachers. When I was in 5th grade, the principal of our school was Mrs. Thelma Stone. And, you know, my mother had left home, and it was my younger brother and I, and we were having a tough time. My dad was doing the best he could with us. And I remember I went down to the principal's office a lot. My younger brother was struggling in school, and Mrs. Stone took me into her office, a 10 or 11-year-old boy. And I had this feeling that she was talking to me like an adult, that she cared about our family situation among all the children in the school. Later on, I found out that she was a very active member of the Federated Church in town, and that she saw her extension of her ministry in the work that she did in the school, and I know many of our teachers feel the same way. They may not be saying the word of Jesus all the time, but yet they exude that spirit of Jesus. When I was in college, I went through a difficult time, and I've shared some of that with you before, and kind of went through a depression, and long story short, I was asked to leave the university, and I remember going in to see this man. His name was Phil Booker, and he was somewhere in the dean's office, and we talked, and he said, I know you got a lot of things going on, and this is our policy. Your grades aren't up to stuff, so you have to go back out, and you can reapply in a year if you've done something to show us that you really are ready to come back to school. And I remember Phil Booker probably had seen hundreds of students like me, and yet there was something about him that gave me a little bit of hope on that day, one of the darkest days of my life. And so a year and a half later, I did come back. I had managed to go to community college and made Dean's List and was showing I was serious. And I went into his office and I said, "Mr. Booker, I did it." And he looked at the records, the transcripts that were there, and he said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, I'm going to put your name forward." And I don't know how the process worked, but I was reinstated at the University of Connecticut. And I thought that would be the last time I ever saw Mr. Booker. But then I came a few years later, and I was serving as a pastor of the church in Norwich. And during the Lenten season, we would have these combined community services. And we would go to the Congregational Church, the Methodist Church, and each week a different church. And we went to the Park Congregational Church, and they're handing out bulletins with someone I never expected to see again. It was Mr. Phil Booker. And when I went up to him, he didn't, I wish I could say, oh, he recognized me and said, boy, you've made it, you've done well and everything. He didn't recognize me at all. And at first I was a little disappointed, but then I began to realize that Mr. Booker treated every one of us with the same grace and encouragement that he treated me. And he made me feel unique and special. And it was all because of his faith and the way he lived out his calling. When he died, I sent a note to his children and told them about that story. And they said, thank you for sharing that. We always knew that our dad lived his faith. He didn't talk about it a lot. He was active in church. But it's nice to know that he lived his faith. You see, that's what Jesus was saying when he said, you are the light of the world. The only Jesus some people may see, you've heard this saying, is you or me. And when we live out our faith in such a way that it becomes so visible that the blind begin to see, then we know that we have done what we've been called to do. I encourage you, if you've been hiding your faith under a bushel basket, live your faith. Take it out and put it on a lampstand. Let people see. You don't have to be talking about Jesus all the time. But if you live like Jesus, if you follow the commands of Jesus, people will know and you'll be a blessing. So go and let your light shine. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. I hope you will too. Amen. We're going to close our service now by singing our final song, and it's printed in the bulletin and up on the screens. You can also find it in the hymnal. It's number 118. This is our prayer, that we would glorify